We've just sung, Father, that you would help us to see that Jesus is all that we need when the valley is at its darkest. And I pray that as we reflect on that this morning together, that we would know the wonderful comfort that David speaks of here. That we're able to walk through these dark valleys, fearing no evil. It's a remarkable confession that he makes, and I pray that you would transform us as we hear your word preached now, and as we hear it read, that would be our reality in our lives. Transform us today, I pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. So Psalm 23, a psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. This morning we're going to focus in on the first part of verse 4. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil. And I suspect that verse 4, if you're unfamiliar with the Bible, or indeed familiar with it, is the verse that, if you were to say Psalm 23, along with verse 1, might be the verse that you know the best. It's the verse that's often quoted. It's a verse that comforts and warms us when life is at its most difficult, or when we face tragedy. Famously, it's been used in all sorts of different circumstances. Famously, you might remember, if you're old enough, that on September the 11th in the evening, as George W. Bush addressed the nation of America after the attacks on the World Trade Center, it was this psalm and this verse particularly that he used to help the nation as they faced that great and horrible day in their history. It's a verse that you've likely heard read at funerals. Perhaps it's your favourite verse. It's the one that you've turned to for comfort. Perhaps it's a verse that you've turned to when you're with someone who's suffering. You know it's a good verse. It's a verse that does bring comfort, and so it's often the verse that you turn to say, look, he's with you. It's okay. Gives us words when we don't know what to say, when the very worst things happen to us or those that we love. But I want us to see this morning that as good as that is, there are even richer resources in these few words than simply just, I guess, a platitude to say when darkness comes. Resources for us are here that when you find yourself in the darkest valley, you're able to confess with David, I'll fear no evil. You're able to know with David that the valley of darkness is one that you will walk through. In other words, there is light at the end of the tunnel. You can be confident of that. It won't end in darkness forever. As we look at it, though, I want us to see three, I guess, important things that will help us to have these convictions. Firstly, we need to know the reality of the darkness. We need to acknowledge and know the reality of the darkness. We are in a culture particularly where we spend a lot of time and resources avoiding the reality of suffering, don't we? We avoid talking about sickness and death, despite it being often all around us. Recently, Katie and I started to write our will. And it was a horrible experience. We've not finished it yet, but it's a horrible thing because you have to think through all these different scenarios of what happens when the worst happens. It's something that we keep pushing away. My parents are getting to the age now where it'd be really helpful to talk to them about, well, what will happen when sickness comes, when they're not able to care for themselves. And it's a difficult conversation, and one that often ends in us joking a bit and never really making any plans at all. We kind of avoid it, don't we? Talking about death and suffering and sickness. We don't want it to be a reality in our lives, so we don't want to talk about it. And we spend billions of pounds or dollars trying to avoid it, whether it's the next gym membership, the diet program that you're on, the cosmetics that you're buying, or the workout programs that you're trusting in. We're just desperate to avoid talking about it. And yet in the Bible, the reality of death and suffering appears on page 2. It's in the first and second chapter, and particularly in the third chapter of the Bible, that death is a reality. It's the big plot line of the Bible story that humanity, having been created for life forever in relationship with God, in a creation that works with them for fruitfulness, is because of their turning away from the God who made them now a world of curse and death and suffering. And the Bible's story is one about how God, who was with his people in the garden, might be with his people again because he will deal with the problem of death. And it's not just a big Bible theme, is it? Let's be honest. Death's shadow follows us. We live in a world that is east of Eden, don't we? A world under God's curse, a world that isn't what it ought to be, and far from what we hope it will be one day. And it's that reality that David's singing about in verse 4. He's not singing about a difficult day at the office. He's not singing about, like, getting a cold and things being hard, though it includes that. He's singing about the reality that death's shadow follows us, that we live east of Eden. See, the word that's translated in our English versions, the shadow of the valley of death, that I think comes from the New King James Version, is really, literally just means deep darkness. In the valley of deep darkness. And that phrase, deep darkness, appears in the Old Testament in lots of different places, but in one particular example, we read in the book of Job. Job says this, "For deep darkness is mourning to all of them, for they are friends with the terrors of deep darkness." The word for evil in verse 4 is not just about, Satan and the devil and all that kind of thing. It's kind of an open-ended word. So it could be about a particular evil David faces, or it could be about just the reality that the world is not as it should be, that so much of it is broken is broken. And we too feel this deep darkness, this shadow in sickness, in a heavy cold, in the clouds of depression, in unkind words spoken in an argument, or the school bully who makes you feel small. And all the terrible things that come at us in all sorts of different ways or have come at us, that's what David has in mind here, that suffering is a reality and it's a deep darkness. This is life east of Eden, under the curse of thorns and thistles and snatchy hearts. A world where relationships get messy, where doctors diagnose people with cancer, where there's unfair criticism, where you're treated badly. One writer puts it like this. A guy called J. Mason says, "The valley of the shadow of death is a scene of great and uncommon distress, of such trials as to overpower the soul, throw it into amazement, break its purposes, fill it with alarm and horror like that which invades trembling nature at the approach of the King of Terrors." In other words, the King of Terrors is the reality that we all will face our death, but death casts its shadow back over our lives in all sorts of ways. See, David's singing about the reality of our world and his experience of living in it. And I suspect David doesn't have one particular moment in his life in mind, But like Isaac Watts says in his hymns, that there's been many dangers, toils, and snares. Read his story in the book of 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 Kings, and you'll see the life of David. One marked out by sorrow and suffering of mistreatment and treating people badly. And as David looks back and reflects, he says, look, my journey through the darkness is not unique to just me. It's the life of faith that God calls us to. In fact, we're in the story of the Exodus again. It's one thing that we've been seeing. If you want to listen back to the other talks that we've done in this series, you can find them on YouTube. But Psalm 23 is packed full of the Exodus story in all sorts of ways. And the valley of deep darkness is exactly how the Bible described the journey of the people of Israel through the wilderness as they escaped Egypt and headed towards the promised land. They were called to go through, according to Jeremiah, in a land of deserts and pits, in a land of drought and deep darkness, in a land that none passes through, where no man dwells. It's this idea of the wilderness. It's the life of faith, walking with the Lord. And for the people of Israel, as they left Egypt and made their way to the promised land, they had to go through that deep darkness, through that valley, until they tread the verge of Jordan, as we'll sing, I think, a bit later. My point is that David's point is not that the deep darkness is a bad day. It's not an interruption to David's usual life where he's comfortable and happy and everything makes sense. No, it is the life of faith, is to walk through the dark valleys. To face up to the reality that sometimes life is really, really tough. But all of the time, death is casting its shadow over us. Now, can I say that I think that's a very different way to thinking about suffering? You often hear the objection, or maybe you've heard this objection, to taking Christianity seriously, that if an all-powerful and an all-good God existed, then surely suffering wouldn't. Surely if he's good, he would want to do something about it, and if he was powerful, he would do something about it. But we see the reality of our world, that there is lots of evil and suffering around us. Just turn on the news. So clearly, he's either not powerful, he's impotent, he can't do anything about it, or worse, he's not good. He's got the power, but he chooses not to do anything about it. But either way, the God of the Bible, who claims to be good and powerful, can't exist. That's the logic. And it's a powerful argument, isn't it? It feels, well, yeah, okay, I'm not quite sure what to do with that. But in the Bible, that's not David's logic at all. David says, look, no, suffering and brokenness and evil and curse is the world that we inhabit. It's God's world. It's the world east of Eden. It's the world under his judgment because of sin. Actually, the logical answer to that problem of suffering is not that God is neither good nor powerful. The easy answer, and it's not the answer you say to someone that's suffering, but the easy answer to that question is, well, maybe he's got reasons for suffering that we don't quite understand yet. But that said, the Bible doesn't pretend it's not there. The Bible's not like, I know suffering's hard, but pretend it's not there, hide from it. Or pretend it's less bad than it really is. Friends, that will be no help to someone who's really suffering, for you to say it's not that bad. Sometimes some people look at these verses and say, well, if David can walk through the darkest valley and fear no evil, maybe the evil's not as bad as we think it is. Maybe the darkest valley isn't actually that dark. But that's no help to people who are really suffering. And I know that's no help to you if that's your experience this morning. To say, smile, Jesus loves you. That's not the point here. No, David wants to say, I can walk through the darkest valleys, the deep, dark valley. The darkness that really is terrifying sometimes, that is a world of terrors. Pretending it's not that bad or finding ways to avoid it and hide from it, that won't be any help. No, the wise believer knows that we are always in the presence of death from the moment that we're born. For most of us, the shadow has not quite reached us yet, has it? The sun, if you like, is high in the sky, and we can't really see the shadow of death yet. We're unaware of it. That's a wonderful place to be, but it's not the reality for everybody, is it? For some, it feels like the sun is almost set and the shadows are long and scary. And that's the first thing I want us to see. Let's see that the darkness is real. To know the reality of the deep darkness. But look at the verse again. David's not just saying, look, the valley's deep, is he? He's saying that I can walk through it and that I can fear no evil. How is that possible? I think that's the real objection to suffering that's quite hard to talk about. It's not the logical, philosophical one I mentioned earlier, but is there any hope? Is there any hope for people who are suffering? Is it possible to face the terrors, to face up to the reality of the shadow of death without fear? Is it possible to walk through knowing that it won't end in disaster? And David says, yes. And it's not because the shadows are not really shadowy, or the evil is not really that scary. No, it's because of the heart of the verse at the heart of this psalm. Look down at verse 4. This is right in the middle of the text in the Hebrew Bible. For you are with me. That's why David can walk through. For you are with me. Secondly, you see, David knows that the Lord leads him through. David knows it's the Lord who leads him through. I don't know what you're like walking alone when it's dark, or maybe walking in the dark through a place that you know has some sort of bad reputation. But often in those places, you kind of become uber alert, don't you? You pick up the pace. Maybe you run through or jog through. You don't walk. You don't stroll, do you? You might look for a bus. Or you might take your phone out and ring someone just to make lots of noise because you don't like the darkness. But in these verses, the shepherd's presence enables the sheep to walk through the deep darkness. In fact, look down at verse 4 with me. We'll look at this next week more closely. But notice that the sheep are comforted at the end of verse 4. He has this confession, verse 4, third line, I will fear no evil. See, these sheep, David himself it's the same sheep as verses 2 and 3, who are content and at rest, who are so fearless because the shepherd's with them that they're able to lie down. Not be alert. And that's because the shepherd is not passive in the deep darkness. No, as we've been seeing all the way through the psalm, the shepherd is the one who's leading through the darkness. In other words, the righteous paths that he treads out ahead of us that we looked at last week, that he asks us to walk through, are righteous paths through the valley of deep darkness. Now, this is a difficult thing to understand, but it is truly wonderful to hold on to. You see, the deep darkness, the valley with sharp rocks and vertical ravines that looks terrifying, has not caught the shepherd off guard. It's not that he tried one path that was green meadows and his only option was now to lead us through a deep valley because he took a wrong turn somewhere. The shepherd is not a kind of shepherd who's kind of seen a danger sign and ignored it and, taken the flock through at great risk to them. He doesn't work for Red Bull. He's not after a thrill-seeking adrenaline ride, looking for a rush and seeing if he can get the sheep through the darkness without losing any of them. And, well, maybe one will die, but oh well. No, the point of the psalm is, as we've been seeing, the shepherd it's comforting to be with this shepherd precisely because he's the one who's led us through the dark valley. He's walked the path before us, as we sing in one of our songs. See, we can often read this psalm as George Bush probably read it. To think that most of life should be comfortable, and that God wants us to be happy and comfortable and pain-free all the time. And sometimes bad things happen, and, well, it's okay that he's with us. But friends, this psalm is saying, no, the reason, and I say this with great care, but the reason that you are in a valley this morning, if you are, is precisely because the shepherd has led you there. He leads. See, we reach for platitudes, don't we? We say things, someone loses a job, and we'll say something like, well, I'm sure God has something better for you. A relationship breaks up. Well, I'm sure God has someone else in mind for you. Or worst of all, you hear some Christians around the world say that, look, the reason you're suffering, the reason you're poor and in poverty is, well, you just lack faith. You've not lived right, and God's out to get you. If you just had faith, if you gave your money away, then you'd be rich. You'd have a suffering-free life. Like Job's friends, who think that something bad, Job must have done something horrible to have the life that he has. Friends, that's horrible, ugly theology. No, the Lord of Psalm 23 is the Lord who leads through the darkness. Now, I know that raises all sorts of questions, difficult questions. But one writer puts it like this: the unexpected development in the story of Psalm 23 is that the good shepherd's paths of righteousness sometimes include the valley of the shadow of death. If I find myself in the valley of deep darkness, it is because he has led me there. Now, don't mishear me. I'm not saying, therefore, we should look for suffering, or we should embrace it, or enjoy it somehow. Like, some people say, suck it up and enjoy it. I like to suffer, or that we pretend that it isn't really that bad, as I said earlier. No, the Bible's really clear. The darkness is deep and terrifying, and a world of terrors. But the shape of the life of faith means, well, you can walk through it because he's leading you through it. So the question of faith asks, look, not just, Lord, relieve me from this pain, and that is a legitimate and appropriate prayer, as we'll see in a minute. But perhaps the first question is, what does it look like for me to walk in paths of righteousness through this dark valley? Not what tablet can I take to escape it. Not what will get me back to green pastures and rest as soon as possible. Please, I'm not saying don't take medicine. I just want to make that very clear. But of course, we should do those things. It is really okay to pray for people to be healed, or that they find jobs, or that depression would lift. I'm not saying that we should not do any of those things. But I am saying that when the valley approaches, or the sun is hidden behind the mountain cliffs, it is not because the shepherd has misread the sat-nav. When we see evil in the world or experience its effects, it isn't because, Satan has had a good day and taken the Lord off his bike, off guard. It's like he's got a jab in when he didn't see and knocked us about a bit. No, it's because the Lord has led us down those paths. Now, again, got to be careful. God's not responsible for evil. Nor is it the case that these dark valleys exist separate from the Lord's will and he has no choice but to lead us through. No, the Bible is clear. Nothing that happens, everything that happens because it's already passed through his righteous hands. And yet we're still responsible for the things that we do wrong. It's beautifully summed up in the story of Joseph, where, do you remember Joseph says to his brothers, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Or supremely in the death and resurrection of the Lord Jesus, when Peter says, you were wicked men and you killed Jesus. You handed him over to be crucified, but it was the Lord's providence and to rescue and to save through his death. No, the Lord leads through dark valleys. And those dark valleys, he has tread the paths before us. Think of Jesus in Gethsemane. Listen to Luke's gospel as Luke describes Jesus' experience in the garden. He writes, then he withdrew from the disciples about a stone's throw away and knelt and began to pray, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Then an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him. In anguish, he prayed more fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. Jesus walked through the deep, dark valley. So much anguish that he sweat drops of blood. See, the deep darkness is painful. And it's hard trusting God in the midst of them. And yet Jesus walked through, didn't he? As Connie helpfully reminded us earlier in the service, all the way through the darkest valley, out the other side. Friends, as dark as the valley gets, as jagged as those rocks feel on your feet, as steep and as unstable that the cliff face feels, please would you know that he is leading. You will get through it. You will get to the other side because he's walked ahead. He's not scratching his head wondering what to do. He's not overwhelmed or confused. It's remarkable, isn't it? This is what the Bible would say to us in the midst of suffering. Do you see the resources that are available here? Now, okay, people do reject it. And maybe that's you this morning. Maybe you're thinking, look, I just can't accept that the world that I see that's broken around me means that God is good and powerful. I find that there's too strong an argument. Well, if that's you, please would you see that rejecting the God of the Bible doesn't help you. Doesn't help you with the reality of the deep darkness. If you're honest and wrestle with it, if you go towards atheism, for example, which some people do, what is suffering and evil and brokenness in atheism? It is the way the world is, that's it. It's neither good nor bad. You might not like it, but it's ultimately meaningless. There's no purpose behind it. It's just the way it is. Get over it. Now, to pretend that evil and suffering is meaningless might help you. At one level, it might give some sort of answer. But it will be of no comfort to you when the doctor says, I'm afraid, sir, it's cancer. And we can't operate. You might be tempted to turn to other religions. Eastern religions like Buddhism, for example, or Islam. But in different ways, both those worldviews say of suffering and evil, they're kind of just God's will. You just got to get on with it. That's basically what Islam says. And Eastern religions like Buddhism say, look, the problem is not the suffering you're experiencing. The problem is your desire for comfort. If you can free yourself up and get to a state of nirvana where you don't desire things, then you don't suffer, do you? If you didn't desire this relationship with your children, then you wouldn't feel the loss of their cancer diagnosis. That's no help, is it? So don't think that just rejecting the God of the Bible means you're free from answering the question of suffering and evil. Quite the opposite. I think you're left in a more dreadful place. But if you know Jesus this morning and you're trusting him this morning, then however dark the valley is, he will lead you through. And you can know that for certainty because he's already walked through the darkest valley and he's come out the other side in resurrection life. He's gone through it. So know the reality of the darkness, know that he leads. Finally, know, and more briefly, that he is with you. I said earlier that in the Hebrew language, when you include the title of the psalm, a psalm of David, then verse 4 and those words, "For you are with me," lie right in the heart of David's poem. The psalm is a bit like an arrow. The first half pointing towards "you are with me," and sort of the second half pointing towards "you are with me." See, the shepherd who leads is also the companion who walks alongside. We'll see this next week in greater depth of what it means that he is with us with his rod and his staff and what those things are doing there. But I just want us to end by saying this is the wonderful reality. This is why we know we're going through, because the Lord who leads is the Lord who's with us. And that brings wonderful comfort. I don't know if you remember Hugo's testimony when he worked for the church. He shared it a couple of times. But he tells the story of how something was really significant for him is that when he was a boy, about 10 years old, his cousin David was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumour. His cousin was 10, they were close family, knit together, and that really shook Hugo, that could happen to someone of his age. But it wasn't just the fear of that happening that shook Hugo, it was David's reaction to the suffering that he was experiencing. And the most remarkable part of the story, one of the most remarkable parts of his illness, was that the moment that he was told, he was lying on a hospital bed, surrounded by his parents, and I think his brother or sister, and a doctor came round and said to David, "David, I've got some bad news for you. We've discovered that the tumour is inoperable, and you're likely going to die very soon." Something like that. And this 10-year-old boy looked at the doctor and said, "It's okay. I have a friend called Jesus who has promised to take me through death." To which the doctor replied, "David, I'm so glad you said that, because Jesus is my friend too, and I know that he'll do that." It's remarkable, isn't it? I love the fact that Hugo's cousin's called David, but he knows the Lord of Psalm 23. There's no miraculous end to that story. David eventually died of his illness. But the Lord took him through into resurrection life. Now, one day, if you want to, you could meet David. Friends, I know that your situation means it's hard for you to see clearly. I know your anxiety means that you want to shut the world out sometimes and hide away. I know that your depression makes you feel like the world is just a cloud and you just can't see a way through. I know that for some of you, the paths that he's asking you to lead are terrifying, of what the consequences might mean for you to walk down that path. I know for some of you it's easier to gossip about your boss who's mistreating you than pray for them. I know that pursuing that relationship that you know is not God's best does bring a level of comfort and excitement. I know that some of you are dreading Christmas, and so you're finding ways to take yourself away from the Rylands because you can't cope with the idea of another anniversary without that person there. I know that some of you are confused this morning as to why God doesn't seem to be listening, why he's not answered your prayers. But know that in the midst of the darkness, he is with you. He's not leading you into the dark valley, and he's not standing ahead waiting for you to catch up with him. No, he's trodden the path before us, and now he's doubled back, and he's alongside, saying, come on, it's this way. And so whatever you're going through this morning, please would you ask the question, how can I walk with the Lord through this valley? Who is the Lord for me in this moment? Now, they're not always easy answers to those questions. But the promise is that his word is a light to our path and a lamp to our feet, that it can make us wise. It's one of the reasons that we employ Laura to do what she does, to help us to do this, to walk with the Lord through the particular and specific suffering that we face. But would you ask that question? What does righteousness look like? A long day, a heavy day, and it's a members' meeting. Do you know what? I'm just going to get a pizza and stay in. Or you could come and encourage your brothers and sisters. Whether that's members' meeting or a prayer meeting, a home group, whatever it is. What does it mean to walk with the Lord? To love him and his people in the dark valley. I know the valley's dark. I know the rocks are sharp. I know that it feels like there's danger all around. But friends, a bottle of wine, it'll just give you a headache in the morning. You'll curl up on the sofa and you might hide from the world, but the darkness will be there when you wake up. But David says, look, the shepherd is leading you. Will you walk with him? Will you face the difficulty in your marriage? Will you face the bully at work or in the school playground? Will you face the difficult, messy relationship? Not avoiding it, not hiding from it, not running away. But would you walk with the shepherd knowing that you don't need to fear evil, and that his right paths will lead you through, such that Paul says in 2 Corinthians to ever-increasing glory, that the suffering is not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed in you one day. He's always at work. See, he's with us. In fact, making it possible for him to be with us is exactly what the Bible's all about, isn't it? You see, Jesus did walk through the dark valley, trusting his Father's plan. But what happened to him in the darkest valley? What happened? Well, the Father stopped walking with him. Do you remember Jesus' words on the cross? Why have you forsaken me? You see, the Father turned his face away from the Son he'd loved for all eternity so that he might turn his face towards you in a welcome and an embrace in the darkest valley. He was forsaken so that you might be forgiven. He was excluded that you might be welcomed. He was left alone in the deep darkness so that he might walk with you forever. See, we can be patient when things go against us. We can be thankful when things go well. And for the future, we can have confidence in our faithful God that nothing will separate us from his love. As another ancient confession says, all creatures are so entirely in his hands that they can neither move nor be moved without his will. Let's bow our heads and pray together. If the band wants to come up, that'd be great. Just take a moment. As I often say, it's our conviction that Jesus speaks through his word preached. So he's been addressing you this morning, the Good Shepherd. What's he been saying? Maybe just take a moment to let that crystallize. And then let me encourage you to share that with someone here, or even pray it through. But in a moment, the band will lead us in a couple of songs that will help us to rehearse some of the truths that we've listened to this morning.